I'd like to start with a thanks and a couple of apologies. My thanks to the organizing committee and Kasia in particular for this invitation to present. I am very sorry that I am not there in person. I failed to check on the travel requirements for going to the European Union, and there were some issues with my passport that prevented me from being able to travel. And since I'm the American representative in this conference, I'd also like to apologize for Donald Trump. This conference has a leitmotif on linguistics as either a distinct or an interdisciplinary science. That's been part of my career, I think, since the beginning. I would like to talk about this from three different perspectives. One, as a representative of American generative phonology. Second, from a few different theories that have been proposed based on usage, based on functional constraints on language, and based on evolution of phonological forms diachronically. And then also my personal research agenda, which has been to take some of these functional influences and extend them into the cognitive domain. American generative phonology, such as in Ken Stewitz's textbook, uses phonology as a symbolic computational system, has linguistic domains that are modular and distinct from one another, and along the line with the rest of American generative phonology, treats grammar as part of human genetic endowment, and therefore special and distinct from ordinary cognition. In usage-based functional or evolutionary phonologies, we have language use for communication having an influence on phonological forms, for example, from perception and production in functional and evolutionary phonology. These constraints can be affecting language synchronically, diachronically, or in the case of a usage-based phonology, both synchronically and diachronically. My own cognitive extensions to functional phonology have been to claim that functional influences on language include cognitive processing of phonological representations, and that drawing a line between phonological and phonetic representations ends up being a dubious thing to do from this perspective. I will also argue that functional influences are pervasive at all levels of language systems, individual language patterns, as well as within the lexicon, further providing support for functional influences on language. This talk will go through three distinct sets of data. First, on the cognitive influences on phonological patterns. Second, on fuzzy phonological categories and or less fuzzy phonetic categories, where making a distinction between phonology and phonetics has become difficult given the data we have these days. And third, the presence of pervasive functional patterns both across and within languages. The conclusion from these three sets of data, then, is that we can't have a phonology that is symbolic or modular and separated from other aspects of language and cognitive processing. The methodology that I have used in my research and will be discussing today in general takes the perspective of laboratory phonology, which has been around for 30 years or so. Laboratory phonologists have broadened the kinds of methodology that gets used in phonological research, including considering phonetic data, considering behavioral experiment data, considering data from corpora, whether those corpora are from actual language usage or something like a model of the lexicon of the language. Sometimes we also implement computational or statistical models of patterns in language. So to start with functional influences on phonological patterns, the idea of production and perception influences on phonological patterns has been around throughout my career and even before, for example, with David Stamp's natural phonology. Looking at these functional patterns, they are generally gradient. Boersma's functional phonology, for example, encodes perception and production constraints down to measurements at the phonetic level, things like voice onset times in milliseconds, for example, in an optimality theoretic grammar. Hayes and Wilson, typo there, sorry, use a symbolic optimality theoretic grammar, but have numerically weighted constraints to get gradient patterns. Hayes and White use that same type of symbolic OT grammar with weighted constraints, but claim that constraint discovery is biased toward phonetically natural phonological constraints, resulting in functional patterns. Extending these functional patterns to cognitive influences started in my work anyway, with the notion of similarity being an influence on phonological patterns. This came from the analysis of long-distance consonant co-occurrence constraints that showed quantitative patterns based on similarity across the lexicon. These kinds of patterns have been found in many languages, but the originating case is place of articulation constraints in Arabic, which have been known for quite a long time. This table packs a lot of detail in it. It is the ratio of observed combinations of consonants in different phonological categories divided by the expected number of combinations given the frequency of occurrence of individual consonants in those categories. And this was the data over the Arabic lexicon. Along the main diagonal, we have very low numbers from 0 to 0.14, meaning 14% or less of the predicted consonant clusters that we would find from a random combination are actually found in the lexicon. As we move away from the main diagonal, we get ratios greater than 1, indicating overrepresentation of other combinations that don't involve these phonological categories combining with themselves, basically. A few of the yellow cells off of the main diagonal, however, show that this is just not an absolute pattern involving these particular defined phonological categories, but that these generalizations extend out to closely related categories like coronal stops and coronal fricatives combining with each other, or combinations involving velars, uvulars, and gutturals, which are strongest within categories, slightly less strong between closely related categories. So we have a co-occurrence constraint within the Arabic lexicon that's affected by similarity within place categories. It's also been shown to be affected by intervening segments, so that distance between the segments and intervening segments play a role in the strength of this constraint. And it's also been found to be affected by position in the word, where this constraint gets enforced more strongly near the beginning of the word and less strongly near the end of the word. These constraints based on similarity, distance in terms of intervening segments, and position within a word have been well-known influences on the production of speech errors for a long time, where speech errors can be modeled as phonological misselections. And so the fact that these same factors influence speech production provides evidence for this being a functionally based phonological constraint on the Arabic lexicon, and in fact on the lexicons of many languages. In a behavioral experiment, acceptability of novel language forms based on the Arabic lexicon were affected by a variety of factors as well. Violations of this place of articulation constraint was one factor, but the presence of a similar word exemplar to the novel word was another factor that influenced acceptability, and the presence or absence of the particular consonant pair that violates the place constraint, or for that matter doesn't violate the place constraint, was also an influence. So in this table taken from Frisch and Zoida, we have at the top half all the cases of no violation and the number of times those novel non-words were reflected or were rejected, by Arabic speakers in a behavioral experiment. On the bottom half, cases of violations of this constraint. Within each of those groupings, we have the presence or absence of a very similar lexical item in the lexicon. And then within each of those two categories, divided between observed consonant combinations or non-observed consonant combinations within each of those specific consonant combinations down to the individual consonants, not just the consonant groups. So both within the violation group as well as the non-violation group, we have increasing rejections when there is no similar word exemplar, when there is no example of that particular consonant pair found in the lexicon. So all three of these factors interacting with the likelihood of rejection of a novel form. The fact that Arabic itself is the seminal case of this place-based co-occurrence restriction actually further reflects the cognitive basis of this process. In order to understand this pattern within Arabic, there is really an important role of the root as a morphological unit, and extending this co-occurrence constraint outside of that morphological root eliminates the restriction. In addition, this important role of the root means we have something going on other than just segmental confusion during some sort of articulatory assembly or during segmental perception or parsing of the word in the segment. Interestingly, the Arabic root also plays an important role in Arabic speech errors, as investigated in a variety of studies by Thomas Berg and collaborators. So we have cognitive functional influences on phonological patterns. We can include these relatively straightforwardly in our usage-based or functional or evolutionary theories, but these are a problem for generative grammar. We've got a variety of non-symbolic patterns that are gradient. We also have interactions between phonology and other aspects of cognition, indicating non-modularity. And in particular, some of these patterns involving frequency over lexical representations doesn't really distinguish what's going on in language sound structure from other cognitive categories. Moving on then from cognitive influences, let's talk a little bit about phonological and phonetic categories and trying to make a distinction between them. The similarity influence that I just discussed reflects a fuzziness or a gradients to phonological categories. So we have gradient category boundaries within the Arabic places of articulation. Now, phonetic categories themselves are inherently gradient. Oops, sorry for the mistake there. Phonetic categories are inherently gradient. But as we try to look at how phonetic categories are defined themselves as categories, even though they are gradient, there is overlap between categories that we can make distinct, create definable categories themselves when we look in the context of higher level generalizations. So examples of this have been shown in studies of phonological learning, where so-called conditional learning plays an important role. When we take overlapping phonetic information, but add lexical information, add indexical information based on speaker identity, add situational information based on the context, such as co-articulation. This can be used to learn distinct phonetic and phonemic categories and provide some higher level generalization that bootstraps the acquisition process. A kind of informal demonstration of this comes from vowel formant production data in English from a large-scale study by Hillenbrand that included men, women, and children in the study. If you just map out all the vowel productions, you get this kind of horrible overlapping mess where distinct categories are indicated in the various ovals, and we see a lot of overlap. But if we start to apply expectations based on other information, for example, the data for children within each of these ovals should be found in higher first and second formants due to the smaller vocal tracts that children have. So our categories are less overlapping when we add the additional information that we're dealing with children. We look at co-articulation. We might expect in the context of a front consonant that the second formant is going to be raised due to co-articulation with the fronted consonant. And so we get another set of slightly less overlapping categories on the basis of adding co-articulatory information. Finally, when we put that information together with indexical information that we're dealing with children and co-articulatory information that we're in the context of a fronted consonant, we get a set of combined overlaps, which gives us context-sensitive vowel categories for children's speech, where each vowel is in fact distinct. This idea of category generalizations helping to sort out phonetic overlap is captured in Munson, Edwards, and Beckman's concept of climbing the ladder of abstraction. So in this figure from one of their presentations, we have phonetic detail in terms of acoustics, in terms of articulation, in terms of individual patterns of voices. And as we analyze all of this perceptual and production and visual data and begin to classify things by categories, by associating them with particular people, by associating them with particular lexical items, those abstractions help us make sense of all of the phonetic variation that's out there. We can make further abstractions over those abstractions, finding segmental information within related words, or finding socio-indexical information within different people that share sociolinguistic characteristics. So the idea here is that we have an information-rich and exemplar system with a lot of detailed data that is multidimensionally categorized so that these categories in context are sharper than what we might see from the overall distribution across a large corpus, for example. One of the research questions this leads to is what is required for a category to emerge or to survive from this massive overlap. So here we have an opportunity for analysis using so-called big data, where we can look at distributions and try to discover categories by modes in those distributions. We also have an opportunity for what we might call small data. If we think we have found categories, looking at our big data, running experiments to try to confirm whether those categories are really represented in people's language or not. There's an interesting discussion of this in a couple of articles that were published in the journal Language about a decade ago. As we consider all of the various dimensions that one might categorize over and all of the different types of categories that we make, the true picture of what we find in language sound structure categories, for example, isn't just going to be a single ladder that gets more and more abstract as we go up. There will be a variety of ladders of abstraction that interact with each other. And for that matter, even within those general abstractions, we might find particular subcases that defy the generalization or create particular subcategories. So an analogy to this comes from a children's game that we have in the US anyway. I'm not sure how pervasive it is around the world, called Chutes and Ladders, where you can use ladders to move up on this grid. But then if you run into a chute, that kind of dumps you back down into some lower level case. And I think this is a slightly more realistic picture of what the process of acquiring all these different phonological categories might be. One of the challenges for this exemplar or data-heavy approach to where categories come from is that it is fairly restrictive. One of the things that humans can do is create ad hoc categories on the fly. There's a lot of evidence for this kind of on-the-fly adjustments in how people deal with categories in cognitive psychology, for example, where the effect of the task that you give people to do in some experiment can be rather large in terms of how they perform. I've seen some aspects of this working in a communication sciences and disorders department due to the clinical setting. So, for example, clients with word finding problems are sometimes given a semantic exercise to create a category on the fly, like things you might take with you camping. That has a variety of semantic components to it. On the phonetic or phonological side, a listener's ability to adapt to disordered speech might be considered one of these on-the-fly categories. Doing this kind of adaptation isn't necessarily different from dealing with individual differences, indexical information, or someone's idiolect. But for clinicians that work with many clients with similar types of disorders, it is probably the case that new categories emerge for them, creating expectations about what someone's disordered speech might be like based on their diagnosis. An example of these fuzzy phonological and less fuzzy phonetic categories in articulation comes from some of my own work using ultrasound recordings of tongue posture. I've looked at onset k consonants in 9 different vowel contexts in English. In the experiment that I've done, there were 2 words for each context, providing representations of this K vowel combination. Each of those words was repeated 3 times across the experiment, so we have 6 different articulatory tokens per consonant vowel combination. And these recordings have been done over a fairly large number of children, young adults, and also healthy older adults in the 55 to 75-year-old range. When you look at ultrasound data of articulation for velar stops, generally what you find is based on the following vowel, there is a fronted stop target and a non-fronted target, and some co-articulatory variation based on the individual vowels. That's shown with representative examples here of the ultrasound image and the resulting trace of the surface of the tongue contour in different vowel contexts. Can analyze this data quantitatively by looking at distances between curves on the basis of distances between individual points within those curves. Since in this data I was looking at data from kids as well as adults, the data were normalized on the basis of size, and to investigate effects of co-articulation. These curve-to-curve distances were aggregated within repetitions of the same consonant-vowel combination and also between. So for example, looking at instances of key with other instances of key versus instances of key in comparison to instances of ko or ku or ka in the experiment. The aggregated data over all of these individuals, looking between categories, which would be the effect of co-articulation on production, we find that as you go from kids with more between category variation to adults with less between category variation, effects of co-articulation diminish, not just through development from childhood to adulthood, but actually continues on into older adulthood across the lifespan. Looking at variation within categories, we also find the amount of variability between distinct repetitions of the same combination decrease, not just from childhood to adulthood, but continue to decrease into older adulthood. So these articulatory categories develop increasing robustness of the onset K as a distinct unit over the lifespan. There's a decreasing amount of co-articulation as you get older, and a greater consistency in your articulation as you get older. So this is an articulatory example of climbing the ladder of abstraction, going from a more holistic articulatory word or syllable onto individual segmental representations. So the data I've shown in this section of the talk is that phonetic categories become less fuzzy when higher generalizations are either used to classify the percepts, making abstractions over these exemplars, or higher level categories become emergent from lifetime practice in articulatory behavior. These kinds of fuzzy phonetic/phonological categories are compatible with a usage-based phonology where frequency of use is an important component of the phonology, and also in a functional phonology where phonetic categories are basically treated by the same grammar as we would expect for more abstract phonological categories. And I don't think there's anything specific about evolutionary phonology as related to phonetic versus phonological categories. Once again, we have problems for generative grammar, however, where we have non-symbolic patterns, and there's a challenge in drawing a divide between what we might call a phonetic category and what we might call a phonological category. And once again, no clear distinction from general cognitive processes, making it less likely that language is a special genetic endowment or a modular processing system. Moving on then to the third set of data, looking at functional patterns both across and within languages. This gets into the notion of where do these functionally affected categories come from. This is pretty much the heart of Blevins' evolutionary phonology, where difficult to process patterns are at some sort of competitive disadvantage diachronically. How should this competition play out then? We know that historical changes spread across the lexicon. They don't just apply universally to all items at a particular time. Looking at more abstract levels, This could be viewed as competing grammars being implemented within the lexicon, or for that matter, within the language, as in Anthony Koch's competition between parameter setting in grammars model of a historical change in syntax. In the case of phonotactics, I would hypothesize that these functional forces acting on the sound patterns of language should be found throughout all levels of the language system. So whatever perception, production, or processing constraints we have create a competitive disadvantage for violating lexical items. Since phonological categories in phonotactics are generalizations over these lexical items, we will have functional phonological patterns at a more abstract level. The analogy here would be like water erosion, where micro-level erosions of small rivulets on a hillside accumulate over time to produce a macro-level structure like a canyon. So if we want to find evidence for functionality in language, we should be able to find difficult to process patterns in a variety of ways or at a variety of levels. We can have a common occurrence of traditional phonological constraints across various languages, so some sort of statistical trend across languages where languages tend to obey these functional constraints more than they don't. And further, as we drill down within languages, we should find those same types of statistical trends, for example, in the possible constituents that languages have and in the frequency with which those constituents occur in language usage. I've begun an investigation of this within consonant clusters using functional notions of sonority. So for example, we have the idea of sonority sequencing, where we should have a rise in sonority as we approach the peak of a syllable, or a fall in sonority as we move away from the peak in the syllable. This may be an articulation constraint having to do with the jaw opening and closing cycle. There's also a potential functional motivation for sonority modulation, where large differences in sonority are better than small differences in sonority due to ease of perception. One view of this is sort of alternating high frequency versus low frequency acoustic spectra, making segments easier to distinguish from one another. Both of these constraints together should work against having lots of clusters within a language. So I have studied this quantitatively across basically tables of consonant cluster existence for 47 different languages. To get more data, I have considered initial, medial, and final clusters where data was available. And the basic idea here is similar to the previous analyses looking at observed occurrences versus expected. How many two consonant clusters do we get within a language versus how many we would expect given the types of initial and second consonants that get used in clusters in the language. Focusing on just two consonant clusters makes for an easier mathematical analysis, and also shorter clusters are more common than longer clusters, so it also gives us more data to work with. What this analysis looks like is represented in a fairly simple case from the language Aboon here. Combinations of a consonant followed by a glide in onset clusters in this language, where we can have initial stops, initial pre-nasalized stops, which might have slightly higher sonority, initial fricatives, and initial nasals, show in raw numbers that the greater sonority difference does result in more actual clusters. But we should also consider how many clusters are possible given the inventory. There are more stops in this language than in the other categories. There are two different glides those stops could be combined with, So our number of possible clusters is also greater in the stop-glide case than it is in the other cases. But if we normalize by that number of possible clusters, take a ratio of the actual number of clusters that get used versus the number that are possible, we find that ratio also declines as the sonority difference becomes smaller. So to aggregate this data across consonant cluster patterns in many languages, I've used this ratio of actual versus possible clusters in just adjacent cells of a table like the one I just showed you. Cases of sonority sequencing would predict that, say, for stop-stop versus stop-fricative clusters, we would have more frequent stop fricative clusters for onsets, more frequent stop. Oh, that's right. Pause again. Sorry about that. I have a typo there. Sonority sequencing would give us more frequent stop fricatives in cases of onsets where sonority rises, less frequent fricative stop combinations for onsets where sonority falls, and for medial clusters that would be a relatively neutral, since the consonants could be associated with separate syllables. Sonority modulation would predict that the stop-stop combinations should be less frequent than stop-fricative combinations, regardless of where we find those combinations. I'll start the analysis with modulation, because that's actually a little more straightforward to look at. Modulation, where larger sonority differences are more common than smaller sonority differences in adjacent cells based on manner of articulation, basically, is obeyed in 72% of the comparisons over 93 different cluster data sets extracted from these 47 distinct languages in the study. So we see a tendency toward sonority modulation, but this was looked at with a one-step adjacent cell pairwise comparison measure, which might not be the best measure. The data are somewhat overlapping and not independent, because the same cell might be used in an up-down comparison for sonority for the first consonant and a left-right comparison for sonority for the second consonant. In addition, we have more than one data set in terms of onset, coda, medial within the same language, and those are probably not independent as well. And last but not least, we don't really know what our chance expectation would be here. Revising this analysis and taking it a little bit further, we have the idea that sonority modulation can be in conflict with sonority sequencing, where a sonority fall is an onset is not a good thing from sequencing, but is useful for sonority modulation. We also potentially have an interaction with the density of clusters in the language. If we have a lot of clusters in the language, they can't all be optimal clusters, so in order to fill out the space of clusters, non-optimal pairs would have to be used. So I used this concept of the density of clusters as a baseline, doing Monte Carlo simulations for comparisons with 10%, 30%, and 50% of the clusters used. The resulting data with each cluster data set represented by the blue diamond is shown here. Cluster density in the language is given across the bottom, basically as a percentage of the possible two consonant clusters that are used overall. The number that obey the prediction of sonority modulation, where larger sonority differences should be more common than smaller sonority differences, is given up the side axis. And the dotted line indicates the 3 data points for Monte Carlo simulation, where clusters were just randomly thrown into a table of consonant combinations and then analyzed with this same measure. So the Monte Carlo simulation gives us an idea that 50% is actually not a bad target for our chance estimate. though that percentage goes down as the density of clusters increases. The language data and a regression model over those show that the language data also support the idea that as you get higher cluster density, you have a tendency toward more violations of sonority modulation. And then last but not least, kind of looking at where actual languages lie along this axis of cluster density, we can see that low cluster density is definitely more common cross-linguistically than high cluster density. So now that we have an idea of how sonority modulation should work based on cluster density and simulations using Monte Carlo methodology, where you generate a large number of random fake languages and see what happens to the predictions, we can put sonority modulation together with sonority sequencing and get something somewhat interpretable. So in cases where sonority modulation and sonority sequencing agree, the predicted percentages, or I should say the predicted combinations where larger modulation differences are better than smaller modulation differences are more strongly obeyed. So we have things up to 76 in initial position or 79% in final position, where medial position, where there isn't really a sequencing issue, gives us kind of a baseline value of 71% near the overall value that we started with. When we look at conflicts between sonority modulation and sonority sequencing, a smaller percentage of our predicted comparisons match the prediction. So for initial, 69%, and for final CC clusters, 58%. So the ability to obey the functional restriction of sonority modulation, or the, I guess I should say, the prediction of sonority modulation is undermined or suppressed when in conflict with sonority sequencing. So these functional sonority constraints would predict that we have an avoidance of sonority, that or bad sonority combinations, I guess I should say, that would apply as individual words are used, because they either violate the production cycle or they violate ease of parsing in perception. The evolutionary phonology approach then would predict that words that have better clusters in them should be more commonly found within a language, looking at the lexical frequency. I've studied this in a couple of places. One was looking at a large number of Spanish medial consonant combinations across an online or an electronic lexicon of Spanish. Here we have the raw number of C1, C2 combinations based on manner of articulation categories that are generally related to sonority. If we take those raw values and turn them into expectations based on the expected frequency of consonant combinations given their use as individual consonants, we see, again, these same sorts of ratios with relatively low numbers indicating infrequent use of combinations relative to the variety of consonants and their usage that's out there. Numbers greater than 1 indicate an overrepresentation of combinations at that particular level. I've included blue and red arrows indicating the pairwise combinations, and predictions for the direction of the arrow indicates an increase in, or a predicted increase, I should say, in the ratio. The arrows that are in red on this diagram are predictions that do not match that expectation, and the ones that are blue are ones that do match that expectation. So this gives you a little bit more insight into exactly how these percentages that I've been using in this section of the talk come from. Basically adding up the number of blue arrows divided by the total number of arrows gives us how many combinations obey those predictions. And you can also see, each cell ends up getting used in 4 distinct combinations, or 2 or 3 if they're along the edges or in the corner. Aggregating the data over that chart, we have 68% of the comparisons when looking across the lexicon at the frequency of use of consonant clusters in multiple lexical items. And that 68% is fairly similar to what we found in the overall analysis of comparisons across languages. So it would appear that we do have some sort of soft or gradient constraint against poor sonority clusters that acts on the lexicon. I've also analyzed English lexicon and have found similar results. And the prediction of this pervasive functional pattern theory is that we should find these things anywhere we look. So these influences of functional constraints being found across languages as well as within the individual lexicons of languages is predicted by evolutionary phonology. It's certainly compatible with usage-based theories of language. It's incompatible with functional phonology as it was implemented in Boersma's optimality theoretic grammar, basically because it's synchronic, so these historical changes aren't modeled, and also using optimality theory takes out the lexicon as a factor in that particular grammar. Similarly, this is also a problem for generative grammar because these kinds of patterns blur the distinction between what's in the grammar, the computational system, and what's in the lexicon, which in generative grammar is looked at as just kind of an accident. And similarly, that lexicon being where some of these phonological categories can emerge from by generalization is sort of backwards from how generative grammar works, where the lexicon should really be predicted from the grammar. So I've covered all of these different aspects of data, looking at cognitive influences on phonological patterns, looking at fuzziness in phonological categories, and categoricalness in phonetic categories, and also talked about how these functional patterns can be found both across languages and within the details of particular languages. So overall, we have this phonological system that doesn't appear particularly symbolic, though categories are important, and is not particularly modular due to these functional influences from other processing locations. Returning back to the leitmotif of the conference, we have, in this talk, Phonotactics in the Lexicon, revealing rich quantitative patterns that parallel phonological rules or constraints that have been in analyses of language phonologies in the past. So from my view, things that have been observed in generative grammar and have been the subject of analyses are just the most categorical versions of these phonological patterns, and that the reality of language sound structure, to really understand what's going on, requires models that can take into account frequency and probability effects, gradient category structures, statistical generalizations across items that are used in the language. If we accept this kind of complexity into our phonology, this actually removes barriers with other fields of linguistics. Socio-indexical patterns that are found in sociolinguistics, language processing patterns that are found in psycholinguistics, including connections more generally with cognitive psychology and with neuroscience. Removing this barrier also gives us more opportunity to understand second language acquisition, and for that matter, understand connections between language and literacy in written languages. The data in this talk reflect a need for having quantitative and experimental methodologies in our study of language sound structure. What I ended up presenting here was basically a focus on overall language patterns and language modeling. In the interests of time, some of the individual difference data and research that was in my abstract were not covered in this particular talk, but individual differences I think are equally relevant to our understanding of what language sound structure and grammar really is. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Once again, I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, especially because I miss out on the opportunity for questions and discussions based on this talk. But please feel free to email me questions at frischsa@appstate.edu. If I get some questions during the conference, perhaps I'll be able to send back some answers and or contribute a little bit to the debate by sending some ideas along. Thank you again.